I spent 30 days in a sterile Atlanta hospital room, fighting off severe sepsis, and not one person from my family came to see me. Not my mother, not my father, not my sister. The only sound keeping me company was the rhythmic, isolating hum of the heart monitor. Then, exactly a month in, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother. It wasn't asking if I was breathing. It read, "Jasmine found her dream dress. Connor's family is old money, and we cannot look cheap. Wire $15,000 by 5 p.m. I stared at the screen, the absurdity of it, temporarily numbing the pain in my body. I opened my banking app, typed in exactly $1, and hit send. In the memo line, I wrote 2 words: "Good luck." Before I tell you what happened when the doors flew open, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to cut the dead weight loose. The quiet of my room shattered less than 3 hours later. The steady rhythm of my heart monitor was drowned out by the sound of heavy footsteps storming down the corridor. The door to room 412 flew open, hitting the wall with a loud crack. My mother Brenda marched in first, clutching her phone like a weapon. My father Calvin followed close behind, his jaw set tight. And then came Jasmine, my 31-year-old sister, the golden child, tears already streaming down her face. They weren't holding get-well balloons or flowers. They were holding their phones, the screen glowing with the notification of my $1 transfer. "What is this?" Chloe Brenda demanded, shoving the screen inches from my face. "Are you trying to be funny? We do not have time for your childish games." I adjusted the blanket over my lap, feeling the slight pull of the IV line in my arm. "I am not playing games, Mom. I sent exactly what I am willing to contribute to Jasmine's wedding." Jasmine let out a dramatic sob, collapsing into the visitor's chair. "You are ruining my life. Connor is expecting a flawless wedding. His family has standards, Chloe. You know this." Connor, the supposed heir to some old money Savannah fortune, had been the center of my family's universe for the past year. My parents treated him like royalty, desperate to secure their place in high society. "And you think my bank account is the key to maintaining those standards?" I asked, my voice raspy from lack of use. "I have been in this bed for 30 days, Jasmine. 30 days fighting for my life, and you haven't visited once. But you have time to demand 15 grand for a dress." Brenda crossed her arms, her designer handbag dangling from her wrist. "Stop being so dramatic. The doctor said you were stable. Jasmine's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. You have always been bitter that Jasmine is the beauty of the family, while you sit isolated behind a desk crunching numbers. Stop being a petty spinster and write the check." The words stung, a familiar echo of every family dinner, every holiday gathering, where my accomplishments were minimized and Jasmine's mere existence was celebrated. They thought I was just some lonely accountant, a convenient ATM to fund their social climbing. They had no idea who I really was. I calmly reached over with my free hand and unhooked the pulse oximeter from my finger. The monitor beeped in protest, a sharp, annoying sound that matched the tension in the room. "I suggest you ask your old money son-in-law to buy the dress," I said, looking directly at Jasmine. "If his family is as wealthy as you claim, 15 grand should be pocket change. Why are you coming to the petty spinster for a handout?" Calvin, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You listen to me, Chloe. You are going to transfer that money right now. We are not going to be embarrassed in front of the Thorntons because you decided to throw a pity party." I met his gaze, my own expression cold and unyielding. "I am not transferring another dime. You can all leave." My heart rate was climbing, the monitor's alarm growing more insistent. Tasha, my best friend and the head charge nurse on this floor, burst through the door, followed by 2 hospital security guards. "What is going on in here?" Tasha demanded, stepping between my father and my bed. "You need to lower your voices immediately." Calvin puffed out his chest, attempting to use his community leader persona. "We are having a private family conversation. Mind your own business, nurse." Tasha's eyes narrowed. My business is the health and safety of my patient whose heart rate is currently skyrocketing because you are screaming at her. She turned to the guards. Escort them out, now. Jasmine wailed again, clutching her mother's arm. This is a nightmare. I cannot believe you are doing this to me, Chloe. Brenda glared at me as the guards moved in. You are making a huge mistake, Chloe. You are embarrassing this family. Calvin planted his feet, resisting the guard's gentle pressure. If you do not fund this wedding, you are dead to this family. Don't bother coming home. You are cut off. I watched them being ushered out of the room, their angry voices echoing down the hallway until the doors swung shut. Tasha quickly reattached my pulse oximeter and checked my IV line, her touch gentle and reassuring. Are you okay? She asked softly. I leaned back against the pillows, a cold, hard smile forming on my lips. They think they are cutting me off, I said, staring at the closed door. They have absolutely no idea. They think I am just crunching numbers in a cubicle. They do not know I paid off their mortgage 3 years ago. It is time to get out of this bed. It is time to go home and collect exactly what belongs to me. The heavy wood of the hospital door slammed against the wall stop with a violent crack. Brenda marched into the room first. My mother wore a pristine, cream-tailored suit and carried a designer handbag tightly in the crook of her arm. She brought the scent of expensive department store perfume into the sterile air of the intensive care recovery ward. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not look at the bandages on my arms or the hollow circles under my eyes. She only glared at me with absolute disgust. Jasmine practically shoved past her. My younger sister gripped her phone so tightly, her manicured knuckles were turning white. She thrust the glowing screen directly into my face. The banking application was open, displaying the single dollar I had transferred to her account an hour earlier. What is this, Chloe? Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing off the linoleum floors. I have been planning the most important day of my life and you send me a single dollar. Are you out of your mind? I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. 30 days. I had been in this exact bed for 30 days, fighting a systemic blood infection that nearly caused my organs to shut down. I had survived on a ventilator and a feeding tube. Through all of it, the chairs in my room had remained completely empty. Now my family was finally here, standing shoulder to shoulder because of a wedding dress. It is exactly what I owe you, I replied, my voice calm and devoid of whatever emotion they were looking for. I thought the memo attached to the transfer was clear enough. Jasmine let out a theatrical gasp and turned to our mother, as if she had just been physically assaulted. Brenda immediately placed a protective hand on Jasmine's shoulder and shot me a look of pure venom. You listen to me, Brenda snapped, stepping closer to the bed. Jasmine found a custom imported silk gown that requires a $15,000 deposit by the end of the day. Connor's family is flying in from Savannah. The Thorntons are old money, Chloe. They belong to 3 different country clubs, and their guest list includes state senators and real estate tycoons. We are hosting a high society event, and we cannot have the bride looking like she bought her dress off a clearance rack. You are going to transfer the remaining $14,999 right now. I looked at my mother and then at my sister. The entitlement radiating from them was practically suffocating. Jasmine wiped a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. Connor is expecting a flawless wedding, she whined, crossing her arms. His mother has been judging everything we do since the day we got engaged. If I do not wear this specific designer, they will think we are poor. They will think I am not good enough for their generational wealth. I need that money, Chloe. You do not need my money, I said, staring directly into my sister's eyes. You need a reality check. Brenda slammed her hand down on my rolling tray table, causing my plastic water cup to rattle. How dare you speak to your sister that way, Brenda hissed. You have always been bitter. You have spent your entire adult life jealous of Jasmine because she got the looks and the charm while you sit isolated behind a desk crunching numbers. The classic defense mechanism. For as long as I could remember, Brenda had weaponized my independence against me. In her eyes, my lack of a husband was a moral failure, and my intense focus on my career was just a sad compensation for my supposed lack of desirability. You sit alone in that dark office of yours every single day. Brenda continued, her voice rising in pitch. You do not go to galas. You do not date. You do not even know how to dress like a woman who wants to be loved. Stop being a petty spinster and write the check. Jasmine is securing her future and marrying into an elite family. You should be grateful we are even allowing you to contribute to a milestone this significant. I listened to my mother's tirade with detached fascination. My analytical brain, the very same brain she was currently mocking, processed their demands like a bad corporate acquisition pitch. They were leveraging emotional guilt to extract capital. It was a terrible strategy. I slowly reached over with my right hand and unhooked the glowing pulse oximeter from my index finger. The heart monitor immediately registered the disconnect and let out a sharp, continuous warning tone. I reached over and firmly pressed the mute button on the machine, plunging the room back into a heavy, tense silence. I refused to let my vital signs be part of their audience. I smoothed the edge of my thin hospital blanket. If Connor's family is swimming in elite generational wealth, I said, my tone dropping to a dead flat register, then Connor can buy the dress himself. Go ask your old money son-in-law to open his precious trust fund and wire you the cash. I am not financing your social climbing. Jasmine gasped again, stepping back as if the words burned her. You are completely selfish, she cried out, pointing at me. You have money sitting in the bank doing nothing while my entire future is on the line. I am marrying the man of my dreams, and you are trying to sabotage it because nobody wants you. That was when my father Calvin stepped out from the shadows near the doorway. He had been standing silently watching his wife and youngest daughter lay the groundwork for his closing argument. Calvin was a man who demanded absolute obedience. He viewed his family as an extension of his own ego, and my refusal to comply was a direct challenge to his authority. He walked slowly to the side of my bed, his large frame blocking out the light from the window. He leaned down, placing both of his hands firmly on the metal railing of my hospital bed. He brought his face uncomfortably close to mine. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His eyes were cold, hard, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I am going to make this very simple for you, Chloe, Calvin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You are going to open your phone right now. You are going to send that money to your mother's account to cover your sister's dress. You are going to apologize to Jasmine for your arrogant attitude. I stared back at him, refusing to break eye contact. And if I decline? Calvin's jaw tightened. The veins in his neck stood out against his stiff white collar. He lifted one hand from the bed rail and pointed a furious, shaking finger directly at my face. If you do not fund this wedding, he sneered, every word dripping with absolute finality, you are dead to this family. Do not bother calling us. Do not bother showing up for Thanksgiving. Do not even think about coming home. You are cut off. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply let his words hang in the sterile hospital air. My father was used to people cowering when he raised his voice. He had spent his entire life cultivating an image of unquestionable authority, using his booming baritone to bully his wife, his employees, and his daughters into submission. But I was no longer a scared little girl seeking his validation. I was a 35-year-old woman who had just stared death in the face and won. A man throwing a temper tantrum over wedding expenses was nothing to me. Without breaking eye contact with him, I calmly reached across the plastic bed rail and pressed the large red button on my call remote. The heavy wooden door swung open less than 5 seconds later. Tasha marched into the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tasha was not just the head charge nurse on the intensive care recovery floor. She was my fiercely loyal best friend since our freshman year at Spelman College. She was also the only person in the world who knew the actual extent of my financial portfolio. Flanking her on either side were 2 hospital security guards who looked like off-duty linebackers. Step away from the patient right now, Tasha commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who ran her ward like a military general. My father stood up straight, instinctively trying to physically dominate the space. He puffed out his chest and adjusted the lapels of his expensive custom suit. You do not tell me what to do in a family matter, nurse. I am Calvin Jefferson. I sit on the City Council Zoning Board, and I am a senior deacon at First Baptist. You will not disrespect me or my family." Tasha did not even blink. She walked right past his puffed-out chest and checked the readouts on my heart monitor. Then she turned to face him, crossing her arms over her royal blue scrubs. "I do not care if you are the mayor of Atlanta, Mr. Jefferson," Tasha said coldly. "My patient is recovering from severe sepsis. Her heart rate is currently sitting at 115 beats per minute because you and your wife are standing over her bed screaming about a party. You are a medical hazard. You need to vacate this room immediately before I have these gentlemen physically remove you for trespassing." Brenda gasped, clutching her designer purse against her chest, as if Tasha had just pulled a weapon. "You cannot speak to us like that," Brenda shrieked. "We are her parents. We have a legal right to be here. I will call the hospital administrator. I will have your job for this. You have a right to sit quietly in the waiting room." Tasha corrected her tone, completely unfazed by my mother's empty threats. "But right now, you are actively endangering my patient. Guard, please escort them to the elevators." The two massive security guards stepped forward, closing the distance between the door and my bed. One of them politely but firmly placed a heavy hand on my father's shoulder. "Sir, it is time to go," the guard said. "Do not make us do this the hard way." Jasmine let out another theatrical wail, stomping her foot on the linoleum floor. "This is so embarrassing," Jasmine cried, looking at the open doorway where a few other nurses had gathered to watch the commotion. "Connor's family is going to hear about this. You are doing this on purpose, Chloe. You are ruining my wedding because you are jealous and spiteful and alone." I leaned back against the stiff pillows and finally spoke, my voice low and steady. "The only thing I am doing, Jasmine, is resting. You brought this circus into my room. Now the circus is leaving." My father shrugged off the security guard's hand. His face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He realized he had lost control of the room, and for a man like Calvin Jefferson, that was the ultimate humiliation. He pointed his finger at me one last time, his eyes dark with malice. "I meant every word I said, Chloe," he shouted as the guards began physically steering him toward the hallway. "If you do not wire that money to your sister today, you are finished. Do not bother calling us when you get discharged. Do not bother coming to the house for the holidays. You are cut off. We are done with you." The heavy door swung shut, cutting off the sound of Brenda's indignant squawking and Jasmine's manufactured sobbing. The sudden silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady returning rhythm of my heart monitor. Tasha let out a long breath and shook her head. She walked over to the side of my bed and gently adjusted my blanket. "Are you okay?" she asked, her professional demeanor melting away to reveal genuine concern. That was a lot of toxicity for a Tuesday afternoon. I let out a dry laugh and looked up at the ceiling tiles. "I am perfectly fine, Tasha. In fact, I think that is the best I have felt in 30 days. Tasha smiled, shaking her head. "I cannot believe they actually came up here asking for $15,000 while you still have an IV in your arm. Your mother is something else. And Jasmine crying about her high society fiancé, please." I slowly sat up, feeling the dull ache in my muscles. "I need to get out of this hospital, Tasha. I need you to sign my discharge papers as soon as the attending physician clears me." Tasha frowned, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Chloe, you just fought off a massive infection. You need at least another week of bed rest. You cannot go back to work at the firm yet. The equity markets will survive without you for a few more days." "I am not going to the firm," I replied, pushing the blanket off my legs. "I am going to my parents' house." Tasha gave me a look of pure confusion. "Did you not just hear your father? He specifically told you not to come back to the house. He said you were cut off. Why on earth would you go over there?" "Because I left my grandmother's vintage emerald necklace in the floor safe in my old bedroom," I explained carefully, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "It is the only thing of actual value in that entire house, and it legally belongs to me. I need to collect it before Jasmine figures out how much it is worth and tries to use it to pay for her imported floral arrangements." Tasha sighed, crossing her arms again. "Chloe, do not do this right now. Your father just threatened to disown you. He thinks he holds all the power. Let him cool down before you go marching into his territory. I looked up at my best friend and allowed a genuine cold smile to spread across my face. That is the funny thing about my father, Tasha. He loves to act like a king standing in his castle. He told me I was cut off. He told me I was dead to the family and that I had lost my home. I paused, letting the absolute irony of the situation settle over me. He thinks he is kicking me out of his house. I continued, my voice dropping to a calm, calculated whisper. But what Calvin and Brenda do not know is that they do not actually own that house anymore. 3 years ago, when my father's manufacturing business took a massive hit, and they were 3 months behind on their payments, I used a blind trust to completely pay off their primary mortgage. Tasha's eyes went wide. She knew I was successful, but even she did not know the details of my private family bailouts. "You paid off their entire house?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," I said quietly. They received a notification from the bank stating an anonymous benefactor had cleared their debt. They spent the next 6 months bragging at church about how God had blessed them for being such upstanding, righteous people. They never once suspected that the anonymous benefactor was the same daughter they constantly belittled for sitting behind a desk crunching numbers. I grabbed my phone off the tray table and checked my secure banking application. I pulled up the legal documents stored in my encrypted files. "They think they are evicting me from my childhood home," I said, tapping the screen to bring up the property deed. "They think they hold the keys to the kingdom, but they are completely unaware that my holding company holds the deed. They are living in my house rent-free. And since they have officially declared that we are no longer family, I think it is time for me to go home, collect my grandmother's emeralds, and begin the eviction process." Tasha stared at me for a long moment before a slow, wicked smile spread across her face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her official nurse tablet. "I will go page the attending physician right now," Tasha said, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Let us get you discharged. It is time for you to go collect your things." I pulled my unassuming charcoal sedan into the circular driveway of my parents' sprawling brick estate. The house was a physical monument to Calvin and Brenda's relentless need for external validation. Every perfectly trimmed hedge and imported stone fountain screamed of their desperation to belong to a class they could never quite crack. They obsessed over appearances while I obsessed over asset accumulation. That was why I drove a standard mid-size car that blended into traffic while holding an 8-figure portfolio in my name. Wealth is quiet, broke is loud, and right now my parents' house was deafening. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet cab for a moment to gather my strength. My body still ached with the lingering phantom pains of a month-long battle against sepsis. My muscles were weak from 30 days in a hospital bed, and my clothes hung a little too loosely on my frame, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The sterile ward had stripped away my last remaining ounce of tolerance for their toxic family theater. I grabbed my purse and stepped out into the warm Atlanta afternoon. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I used my key, turning the heavy brass lock and pushing the mahogany front door open. The immediate sensory overload hit me like a physical wall. The foyer smelled of aggressively sweet floral arrangements and expensive catering food. Event planners and florists buzzed around the grand staircase carrying clipboards and barking orders. The house had been entirely hijacked by Jasmine's wedding industrial complex. I ignored the chaos, brushing past a woman holding a tablet who tried to ask me if I was part of the catering crew. I kept my eyes locked on the sweeping oak staircase and began the slow climb to the second floor. When I reached the upstairs landing, my breath caught in my throat. It was not from the physical exertion of climbing the stairs. It was the sight of 6 heavy-duty black industrial trash bags lining the hallway outside my childhood bedroom. I walked slowly down the corridor, stopping right in front of the pile of garbage. Sticking out of the top of the nearest bag was the corner of a framed certificate. I pulled it free. It was my undergraduate diploma from Spelman College. The glass was cracked perfectly down the middle. I looked into the next bag and saw my favorite winter coats, my running shoes, and the modest business sweaters my mother always criticized for not being flashy enough to attract a husband. They had not packed my belongings into boxes for storage. They had literally scooped up the contents of my life and thrown it out with the morning trash. I dropped the cracked frame back into the bag and stepped over the garbage, reaching for the brass handle of my bedroom door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. My sanctuary was completely gone. The pale blue walls and the quiet space I had maintained since I was a teenager had been aggressively erased. The room had been transformed into a luxurious staging and tailoring area for Connor and his groomsmen. Heavy velvet drapes covered the windows. Racks of expensive imported tuxedos lined the walls where my bookshelves used to be. The center of the room was dominated by a large wooden tailoring pedestal. Standing on that pedestal, looking like a man who believed he owned the entire world, was Connor. Jasmine's supposed old money Savannah fiancé was currently getting his inseam measured by a frantic tailor. Connor wore a crisp white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and a pair of dark trousers. In his right hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. I recognized the glass immediately. It was my mother's prized Macallan Scotch, a bottle she explicitly reserved for impressing high society guests. Connor caught my reflection in the full-length mirror and turned his head. His smug, easy smile radiated the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of failing upward. "Well, look who decided to rejoin the land of the living," Connor said, taking a slow sip of the expensive scotch. "Jasmine told me you were being difficult at the hospital. Good to see you on your feet, Chloe." He spoke to me with the casual condescension of a lord addressing a peasant. He was entirely comfortable taking over my personal space, drinking my family's expensive liquor, and standing amidst my trashed belongings. He represented everything my parents valued, an illusion of prestige wrapped in a white affluent package. They were so blinded by his supposed generational wealth that they gladly sacrificed their actual flesh and blood to accommodate him. I did not yell. I did not demand to know why my life was sitting in contractor bags in the hallway. I operated with the lethal calm of a woman who was already plotting a corporate liquidation. I simply stared at him, analyzing the sloppy break in his posture and the nervous ticking of his jaw beneath the arrogant smile. People with actual generational wealth do not need to try this hard to look rich. "You must be lost," the tailor said, stepping defensively in front of the pedestal. "This area is reserved for the groom's party. We need privacy for the final fittings." I ignored the tailor completely. I did not utter a single word to Connor. I walked straight past the velvet ropes and the racks of tuxedos, heading directly for the back of the room toward my walk-in closet. "Hey, Connor," called out, his tone shifting from smug to slightly annoyed. "Did you not hear him? We are doing wedding prep in here. You cannot just barge in." I stepped into the closet. It had been cleared out of my clothes and repurposed as a holding area for Connor's expensive accessories. Rows of Italian leather loafers and velvet smoking slippers covered the floor. I kicked a pair of designer dress shoes out of my way, sending them skidding into the corner of the wall. I dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor right in the very back corner of the closet space. My fingers traced the familiar seams of the baseboard until I found the tiny groove I had carved out years ago. I pried the loose floorboard up and pushed it aside. Beneath the wood, hidden perfectly in the subfloor, sat a heavy steel combination safe. It was where I kept the only thing in this house I actually cared about, my late grandmother's vintage emerald necklace. It was a family heirloom that Brenda had always hated because it was antique and understated rather than modern and flashy. I reached down to punch in my secure code, but my hand froze in midair. The digital keypad was completely destroyed. The plastic casing was shattered, and the wires were pulled out, leaving jagged edges of broken metal. Someone had taken a heavy tool, a hammer or a crowbar, and smashed the lock with brute force until the internal mechanism gave way. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled upward. The heavy lid swung open with a hollow, echoing metallic groan. I stared down into the dark cavity of the steel box. My grandmother's velvet jewelry case was gone. The safe was completely empty. I stared into the dark, hollow cavity of the floor safe. My breath caught in my throat, but the panic only lasted for a fraction of a second. It was immediately replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I did not scream. I did not throw the broken plastic keypad against the wall. I did not collapse onto the floor in a fit of manufactured hysterics the way Jasmine would have. My analytical brain, the exact same brain my family constantly ridiculed, simply switched gears. The emotional ties I had left to the people living in this house severed, completely dissolving like sugar in boiling water. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a financial crime. Grand larceny. I stood up, brushing the dust from my knees. The sounds of the frantic Taylor and Connor complaining about the break of his imported trousers faded into background noise as I walked out of my former bedroom. I stepped over the black trash bags containing my life and marched toward the grand staircase. As I descended the sweeping oak stairs, the smell of expensive baking vanilla and imported champagne wafted up from the kitchen. The house was a hive of wedding vendors rushing back and forth, but I sliced right through them. I turned the corner and stepped into the massive gourmet kitchen. It was a scene of absolute grotesque indulgence. The sprawling white marble island was completely covered in silver platters displaying half a dozen miniature wedding cakes. Brenda and Jasmine were perched on plush velvet bar stools holding delicate crystal champagne flutes. A woman in a crisp white chef coat was standing across from them, earnestly explaining the subtle flavor profiles of Madagascar vanilla bean buttercream versus Italian meringue. Jasmine was laughing, a high-pitched grating sound that bounced off the custom cabinetry while Brenda nodded in solemn approval. "Where is it?" I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The flat, deadpan frequency of my question cut through the kitchen like a razor blade. Jasmine paused, her silver dessert fork hovering halfway to her mouth. She glanced over her shoulder at me, her eyes wide with manufactured annoyance. Brenda sighed heavily, setting her champagne flute down on the marble counter with a sharp clink. The pastry chef looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing the sudden drop in temperature. She wisely took a step back and began wiping down a perfectly clean cutting board. "Where is what Chloe?" Brenda asked, her tone dripping with exhaustion. "We are in the middle of a very important tasting. We are deciding between the raspberry coulis and the lemon curd for the bottom tier. Could you please not drag your hospital gloom into this room?" "My grandmother's emerald necklace," I said, stepping closer to the island. My eyes were locked onto my sister. "Where is it, Jasmine?" Jasmine rolled her eyes. She actually had the audacity to roll her eyes at me. She placed her fork down next to a crumbling piece of vanilla sponge cake and let out a dramatic breath. "Oh my God, Chloe, are you seriously throwing a tantrum over some outdated jewelry right now? I am trying to curate the menu for a 300-person gala." "The floor safe was drilled open," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The combination lock was smashed. The velvet box is gone. Where is the necklace?" Jasmine shifted uncomfortably on her bar stool, but quickly recovered her arrogant posture. She took a slow sip of her champagne before looking directly at me. "I had a locksmith drill the safe," she admitted casually, as if she were talking about returning a pair of shoes to the mall. "I knew you always kept a stash of cash or valuables hidden in that stupid hole in the floor." I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. "You stole from a locked safe in my bedroom." "I did not steal it," Jasmine snapped, her voice rising defensively. "I pawned it. I needed immediate liquidity, and you were lying in a hospital bed doing absolutely nothing to help your own family." "The Thorntons demand a certain level of presentation, Chloe. Connor cannot stand at the altar looking like an amateur." "You pawned our grandmother's emeralds," I said, the sheer audacity of the crime washing over me. "You took the only heirloom she specifically left to me, the only thing that bypassed your greedy hands in the will, and you sold it to a pawn shop." Brenda immediately stepped in, placing a manicured hand over Jasmine's arm in a protective gesture. She turned her fierce glare toward me, entirely ready to defend her golden child's felony. "Connor's family has standards," Chloe, Brenda said, her voice hard and uncompromising. "You never even go to galas. You never attend charity balls. You do not even have a significant other to take you to a nice dinner. What on earth were you going to do with a vintage emerald necklace? It was just sitting in the dark collecting dust." Jasmine needed the cash to import Connor's custom velvet tuxedo from Milan. "She is securing her future. She is cementing this family's place in society. Be a good sister for once in your life and stop being so utterly selfish." I stared at my mother. I analyzed the absolute conviction in her eyes. She truly believed that stealing my property was a justified tax for my failure to be a social climbing trophy wife. She believed that outfitting her future son-in-law in imported velvet was a legitimate excuse for grand larceny. My grandmother had explicitly left those emeralds to me because she knew Brenda and Jasmine would liquidate her legacy to buy designer handbags. And they had done exactly that. My analytical brain fully switched into predator mode. I was no longer dealing with a mother and a sister. I was dealing with hostile liabilities. They were reckless, impulsive, and financially illiterate. They believed they were playing chess, but they did not even know they were standing on a board that I owned. I did not scream at them. I did not throw the cake platters onto the floor or demand that they call the pawn shop to get it back. Screaming is what powerless people do when they want to be heard. I had all the power. I just needed the paper trail. My eyes scanned the chaotic surface of the marble kitchen island. Amidst the elegant cake samples, the half-empty champagne flutes, and the scattered silver forks, there was a chaotic pile of wedding invoices. Brenda kept all her receipts in a disorganized heap. I noticed a distinct bright pink carbon copy sticking out from beneath a glossy floral catalog. The bold black lettering at the top of the slip was unmistakable. It read, Buckhead Premier Pawnbrokers and Estate Buyers. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Jasmine flinched slightly, leaning back on her stool, but I completely ignored her. I reached right past her face and snatched the pink receipt from the pile. Hey, Brenda, shouted, standing up from her stool. Put that down right now. That is private wedding correspondence. You have no right to touch my things. I quickly scanned this paper. It had Jasmine's signature at the bottom and listed a payout of exactly $8,000 for a vintage emerald and diamond set. $8,000. They had pawned a $50,000 heirloom for pennies on the dollar just to buy a tuxedo. I folded the pink receipt perfectly in half and slid it into the front pocket of my trousers. Give that back to me, Jasmine demanded, sliding off her stool and reaching for my arm. You are so dramatic, Chloe. We were going to get it back after the wedding anyway. We just needed a bridge loan. I stepped back easily, avoiding her grasp. I looked at the two of them standing there in their expensive clothes, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging over their heads. They thought I was walking away defeated. They thought they had successfully bullied the petty spinster out of her inheritance. I reached into my purse and pulled out my heavy brass house key. It was the key to the front door of the sprawling suburban estate they thought they ruled. I held it up between my thumb and index finger, letting it catch the light from the expensive kitchen chandeliers. Brenda frowned, crossing her arms. What are you doing, Chloe? I told you your father cut you off. You do not live here anymore. I know, I said, a cold, dead smile finally touching my lips. I really do not. I held the brass key directly over Brenda's pristine plate. Sitting in the center of the china was a delicate slice of the Madagascar vanilla bean cake covered in thick, expensive fondant. I opened my fingers. The heavy brass key dropped perfectly into the center of the cake, sinking deep into the pristine white frosting with a dull, sickening thud. Brenda gasped, staring at the ruined cake as if I had just committed a murder. Jasmine let out a sharp cry of outrage. Enjoy the tasting, I said, turning my back on them without another word. I walked out of the kitchen, ignoring their shrieks of anger echoing behind me. I marched straight out the front door and walked toward my unassuming sedan. I climbed into the driver's seat, pulled the pink pawn shop receipt from my pocket, and placed it carefully on the passenger seat. I started the engine. It was time to retrieve my grandmother's emeralds, and then it was time to initiate the immediate foreclosure of the house they were currently standing in. The drive from the suffocating manicured lawns of my parents' suburban neighborhood to the dense concrete grid of downtown Atlanta took exactly 42 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence, letting the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the highway center my thoughts. I pulled into a paid parking garage a block away from the address printed on the crumpled pink receipt. Before heading to the pawn shop, I made a necessary detour. I walked into a nearby business center, logged into my encrypted cloud storage, and paid 85 cents to print out exactly 4 pieces of paper. Armed with my documentation, I walked down the street toward Elite Vault Appraisals. This was not a dingy pawnshop with neon signs and barred windows. Elite Vault Appraisals catered to a very specific clientele. They dealt with desperate executives going through bitter divorces, socialites secretly liquidating assets to cover gambling debts, and heirs attempting to monetize stolen family heirlooms. The storefront featured frosted glass, discreet security cameras, and a heavy mahogany door that required a buzzer for entry. I pressed the buzzer. The lock clicked and I stepped into the hyper-air-conditioned showroom. The interior looked more like a high-end boutique than a pawn shop. Glass display cases highlighted luxury watches, diamond tennis bracelets, and vintage luxury handbags. Standing behind a polished marble counter was a man in a sharp charcoal suit. He looked up from his computer monitor as I approached. "Welcome to Elite Vault," he said, his tone practiced and smooth. "My name is Jamal. How can I assist you today?" I did not offer a polite greeting. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled pink carbon copy receipt, and slid it across the cool marble surface. "I am here to reclaim the item on this ticket," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Jamal picked up the pink slip and adjusted his posture. He typed a few keystrokes into his computer terminal, his eyes scanning the screen. "Ah, yes," he murmured. "The vintage emerald and diamond set. A beautiful piece. However, there is a slight issue, miss. I assume you are not Jasmine Jefferson since the ID on file does not match your description." "I am her sister," I replied. "She brought the item in earlier this week. I am here to pay the principal and whatever exorbitant interest rate you have attached to it to get it back." Jamal smiled a condescending little smirk that reminded me entirely too much of my father. "I apologize for the inconvenience, but store policy and state law are very clear on this matter. I cannot release pawned merchandise to anyone other than the individual who signed the original intake contract. You will need to bring your sister down here with her government-issued identification to process the release." I rested both my hands on the marble counter. "I do not have time for bureaucratic theater, Jamal. The person who signed that ticket had absolutely no legal right to the merchandise. She stole it from a floor safe in my bedroom." Jamal held up his hands, palms facing outward in a gesture of fake sympathy. "Ma'am, I hear that story 5 times a day. A husband pawns a wife's ring, a son pawns a mother's necklace. We operate strictly by the book." Jasmine presented the item. She signed the declarations, stating she was the rightful owner, and we paid her out. "If you have a family dispute, I suggest you take it up with her at the dinner table. Until Jasmine walks through those doors, those emeralds stay in my vault." He turned back to his computer, clearly dismissing me. He assumed I was just another emotional family member who would eventually start crying or shouting. He had no idea he was dealing with a woman who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out the 4 sheets of paper I had just printed. I laid them out sequentially on the marble counter right over his keyboard. "Let us review the facts, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a clinical freezing temperature. "Document 1 is a certified copy of my late grandmother's last will and testament. I have highlighted the specific clause where the vintage emerald and diamond necklace with the exact serial numbers matching your intake form is explicitly bequeathed to me, Chloe Jefferson. Document 2 is the official appraisal from a certified gemologist proving the item is valued at $50,000. Jamal stopped typing. He looked down at the papers, his condescending smile beginning to slip. "Document 3. I continued tapping. The 3rd sheet of paper is a pre-drafted police report. It formally accuses Jasmine Jefferson of grand larceny. It also explicitly names Elite Vault Appraisals as a complicit party in the receipt and fencing of stolen property. As an operation handling high-value assets, I am certain you are aware that possessing stolen goods, especially items valued over $25,000, crosses the threshold into a severe felony." Jamal swallowed hard, staring at the police report. I had left the date and signature line blank. "You have 2 options right now, Jamal," I stated, leaning closer to the glass. "Option 1 is you continue to play games with me, hiding behind a store policy that does not supersede criminal law. If you choose option 1, I will call the Atlanta Police Department right now. They will arrive in 5 minutes. They will seize the necklace as evidence, locking it in an impound locker for a year. They will freeze your assets during the investigation, and your discreet high-end clientele will see squad cars parked outside your front door on the evening news. I paused, letting the threat of bad publicity sink into his brain. For businesses like this, bad press was a death sentence. Option 2, I said softly, is you go into your vault, retrieve my property, and process the return right now. I will pay the $8,000 principal plus your standard unearned interest fee. You recoup your cash immediately, you avoid a felony investigation, and I walk out of here with my family legacy. Make your choice. Jamal looked at my pale face, my unwavering stare, and the meticulously prepared legal documents scattered across his counter. He did exactly what any smart broker would do when backed into a corner. He surrendered. "Give me 1 moment," Jamal said, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. He scooped up the pink receipt, turned on his heel, and disappeared through a heavy steel door behind the counter. I stood in the quiet showroom, tracking the seconds on the wall clock. 3 minutes later, Jamal emerged carrying the familiar worn velvet box. He placed it on the counter and popped the lid open. The deep green emeralds caught the overhead lights glittering against the platinum setting. I felt a rare wave of genuine relief wash over my chest. My grandmother's legacy was safe. "The total, with the short-term interest fee, is $8,400, Jamal said, tapping a few keys on his register. I handed him my premium black credit card. "Run it," I said, closing the velvet box and dropping it safely into the bottom of my leather tote bag. Jamal swiped the card and printed out a long release form. As he waited for the receipt to print, he began filling out his internal ledger to officially close the ticket. He glanced down at the pre-drafted police report still sitting on the counter, checking the spelling of Jasmine's name to match his records. He paused his pen, hovering over the paper. He squinted at the document and then let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Wait a second," Jamal muttered, shaking his head as he looked up at me. "Jasmine Jefferson. As in the Jasmine Jefferson who is marrying Connor Thornton." I narrowed my eyes, my analytical brain immediately sensing a shift in the data. "Yes," I answered slowly. "She is Connor's fiancée. Why do you ask?" Jamal ripped the receipt from the machine and slid it across the counter, along with my credit card. He leaned forward, a conspiratorial smirk returning to his face. "Because your sister came in here bragging about how she was marrying into elite Savannah money," Jamal said, lowering his voice. "She was complaining about how she had to pawn this necklace just to cover the cash for his custom tuxedo, because his trust fund was temporarily tied up in some massive offshore investment." I signed the credit card slip and pushed it back toward him. "And you did not believe her?" Jamal laughed, a sharp, cynical sound that echoed in the quiet showroom. "Lady, I do not care what kind of fairy tale that guy is spinning your family. Trust funds do not get tied up when you need to buy a tuxedo." He leaned closer, resting his elbows on the marble. "I know Connor Thornton. Everyone in the downtown pawn circuit knows Connor Thornton." I stopped putting my wallet away. My hands went completely still. "What do you mean you know him?" Jamal shook his head, handing me my copy of the receipt. "I mean, that guy does not have a trust fund. He practically lives in here. Connor Thornton has been coming into my shop for the last 2 years, pawning fake Rolex watches and cheap cufflinks just to cover his sports betting debts. That old money Savannah heir is completely broke." I stared at Jamal, the words ringing in my ears like a siren. Connor Thornton, the golden boy, the elite catch that my parents were literally sacrificing me to impress, was a complete fraud. He was a degenerate gambler living off my sister's desperate need for social validation. I grabbed the velvet box in my bag, holding it tightly. My cold smile returned, sharper and more dangerous than before. They had called me a failure. They had told me I was dead to the family because I would not fund a wedding to a millionaire. I turned and walked out of the pawn shop, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind me. It was time to go back to the suburbs. It was time to show Calvin and Brenda exactly who they had sold their souls to. I stopped with my hand resting on the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. The latch clicked, but I did not push it open. The initial rush of retrieving my grandmother's emeralds began to fade, immediately replaced by the cold, calculating instincts that made me one of the most feared liquidation specialists in my firm. In the world of high finance, an anomaly is never just an anomaly. It is a thread waiting to be pulled, and Connor Thornton pawning cheap cufflinks to cover sports bets was a massive, glaring anomaly. I turned around and walked slowly back to the polished marble counter. Jamal was already organizing his paperwork, clearly hoping our interaction was over. He looked up, his shoulders stiffening as I approached. "I am not here to cause another scene, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low and completely professional. "But I deal in information. Information is currency, and right now you are holding a currency I need." Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back against the glass display case behind him. "I already told you what I know, lady. Your sister's fiancé is irregular. He pawns things. He loses money. It is a tale as old as time. I am not running a gossip column here. Client confidentiality is still a thing." I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my wallet. I retrieved 3 crisp $100 bills and placed them flat on the marble counter right next to his keyboard. I did not break eye contact. "I am not asking for gossip," I replied, sliding the bills forward with my index finger. "I am asking for a professional consultation. My family is about to merge assets with this man. They are under the strict impression that he is the sole heir to a vast real estate and shipping fortune down in Savannah. They are currently outfitting him in imported Italian velvet and paying for a wedding that rivals a royal coronation. If you have data that contradicts that narrative, I am willing to compensate you for your time." Jamal stared at the cash. In his line of work, $300 for a simple conversation was an excellent return on investment. He glanced toward the front door to ensure the shop was completely empty, then reached out and swept the bills into his pocket with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Your family is getting played," Jamal said, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Savannah old money. Please, that guy does not even know how to spell real estate." Jamal turned back to his computer terminal and typed in a quick sequence of commands. He tilted the monitor slightly so I could see the screen but not the exact account numbers. "Look at this transaction history," Jamal instructed, tapping the screen with a pen. "He first came in here about 18 months ago. Brought in a vintage Patek Philippe watch. It was a beautiful piece, probably belonged to his father or grandfather. He spun me this massive story about how his trust fund administrator locked his accounts for a quarterly audit and he just needed some bridge capital for a weekend in Vegas." "Did he ever buy the watch back?" I asked, my eyes scanning the long list of red withdrawal entries on the screen. Jamal let out a sharp laugh. "Not a chance. The grace period expired and I sold it to a collector in Dubai for triple what I loaned him. But that was just the beginning. After the watch, it was sterling silver tea sets. Then it was a set of diamond-encrusted cufflinks. A month later, he brought in a solid gold money clip. Every single time he had a different excuse. An offshore wire transfer was delayed. A real estate closing got pushed back. His wealth manager was on vacation in the Hamptons. He talks a big game, dropping names of country clubs and elite families, but his eyes are always darting around the room like a cornered animal." I processed the data rapidly. Connor was not a wealthy heir facing temporary liquidity issues. He was a parasite methodically stripping his own family of their generational assets piece by piece to fund a degenerate lifestyle. And now that he had run out of his own family heirlooms to pawn, he was moving on to mine. "How desperate is he, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my focus on the screen. "When he came in with my sister to pawn the emeralds, what was his demeanor?" "He was sweating," Jamal said, leaning closer. "He was trying to act cool for your sister, pointing at the display cases and telling her he would buy her a bigger diamond once his accounts unfroze. But the guy was shaking. He needed that cash yesterday. He took the absolute lowest offer I gave him without a single counteroffer. A man with actual money negotiates. A man with a bookie breathing down his neck takes whatever you hand him and runs." I nodded slowly, pulling the pieces of the puzzle together. My parents were so desperate for high society validation, that they had completely bypassed basic due diligence. They saw a handsome man with a smooth southern drawl who knew which fork to use at a dinner party, and they handed over their entire lives. They were currently draining their bank accounts, taking on massive debt, and alienating their only financially solvent daughter, all to secure a union with a man who was actively drowning. "Thank you for the consultation, Jamal," I said, offering a polite professional nod. "You have been incredibly helpful." Jamal smiled, tapping the keyboard to clear the screen. "Anytime, Miss Jefferson. Tell your family to run a credit check next time." I turned and walked out of Elite Vault Appraisals, stepping into the thick, humid air of the Atlanta afternoon. The sunlight bounced off the concrete sidewalks, blindingly bright. I walked to my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The anger that had been simmering inside me for 30 days was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a deep, profound sense of power. Why would a man from a multi-million-dollar Savannah family be pawning cheap cufflinks to survive? Because there was no multi-million-dollar family. There was only a grifter, a terrified, desperate fraud who had found the perfect marks in Calvin and Brenda Jefferson. I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my usual contacts, the bankers, the analysts, the project managers, and scrolled down to a number I only used for corporate emergencies. I pressed the screen and held the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Arthur speaking. Arthur was my firm's top private investigator. He was an ex-federal agent who specialized in corporate espionage, uncovering hidden offshore accounts and excavating buried financial skeletons. If a CEO had a secret gambling addiction, Arthur found the receipts. If a board member was lying about their credentials, Arthur found the original transcripts. "Arthur it is." "Chloe Jefferson," I said, leaning back against the leather headrest. "I need a comprehensive background excavation. Priority level 1. Chloe." Arthur replied, his voice warming up slightly. "I heard you were in the hospital. Glad to hear you are back in the game. Who are we hunting?" "A man named Connor Thornton." I instructed, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of mercy. "He claims to be the heir to a massive real estate and shipping empire in Savannah. I want his actual bank records. I want his credit score. I want a list of every outstanding debt, every maxed out credit card, and every bookie he owes money to. I want to know what he ate for breakfast 3 years ago." "Consider it done," Arthur said, the sound of a keyboard clacking already audible in the background. "Give me 48 hours. I will bring you the entire skeleton." "Make it 24, I said. "My family is hosting a wedding fitting right now. I think it is time I bought them a very special gift." The drive from the discreet downtown pawn shop to the financial district took less than 10 minutes. I pulled my unassuming charcoal sedan into the subterranean private parking garage of the Apex Capitol Tower. The concrete walls echoed with the low hum of luxury European sports cars and armored SUVs, but my reserved parking space was located directly next to the private executive elevator. I bypassed the main lobby and the security checkpoint, swiping my encrypted keycard to access the express lift. My family believed I was a lonely, glorified accountant, trapped in a dark cubicle staring at spreadsheets. They believed my lack of a husband and my refusal to attend their superficial country club dinners meant I was a social and professional failure. They had spent years crafting a narrative where Jasmine was the triumphant star of the family while I was the tragic cautionary tale. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid open on the 50th floor. I stepped out into the sprawling, glass-walled reception area of Apex Capital Partners. I did not work in a cubicle. I owned the firm. I was the founder and majority shareholder of one of the most ruthless and wildly successful private equity firms in the Southeast. While my father was busy shaking hands at local zoning board meetings and pretending to be a power broker, I was orchestrating multi-million-dollar corporate liquidations across 3 continents. "Good afternoon, Miss Jefferson," the head receptionist said, immediately standing up behind her marble desk as I walked past. "The partners are already waiting for you in the main boardroom." I gave her a brisk nod and walked straight down the corridor. The trading floor was a hive of controlled chaos, with dozens of analysts and portfolio managers monitoring global markets, but a distinct hush fell over the aisles as I passed. They knew my reputation. I had built Apex Capital from the ground up, using my grandfather's initial seed money, and an absolute refusal to let emotion dictate business. I did not tolerate inefficiency, and I certainly did not tolerate fraud. I pushed open the heavy double glass doors of the main boardroom. The room was a monument to actual power, not the fabricated kind my family desperately chased. A massive custom mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Three junior partners were seated at the far end of the table, nervously reviewing a stack of legal binders. They stood up immediately when I entered. I did not sit down. I walked directly to the head of the table and leaned forward, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. "Give me the bottom line on the Horizon acquisition," I commanded, looking directly at the lead associate. The young man cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "We have finished the final audit, Miss Jefferson. The target company is carrying 20% more toxic debt than they initially disclosed in the preliminary filings. They are trying to hide it in a series of offshore holding companies. If we proceed with the merger as structured, we expose Apex to significant liabilities. The recommendation of the risk assessment team is to pause negotiations and restructure our offer." "They lied on their disclosures," I stated, my voice dropping to a freezing clinical register. "Yes, ma'am," the associate replied. "They deliberately obscured their debt to inflate the valuation." "Then we do not restructure the offer," I said, reaching for the gold fountain pen resting on the table. "We pull out completely. You leak the findings of our audit to the financial press by the end of the day. Let their stock price completely bottom out by Friday morning. Once they are entirely insolvent and facing bankruptcy, we will buy their manufacturing assets for pennies on the dollar and liquidate the rest. Draft the termination papers." The associates nodded quickly, furiously writing down my instructions. I signed my initials on 3 separate acquisition approvals for other verified targets, pushed the binders back across the table, and pointed toward the glass doors. "Clear the room," I ordered. Within 10 seconds, the boardroom was completely empty. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the sprawling city below. My physical weakness from the hospital stay was entirely overshadowed by the sharp, vibrating adrenaline of a hunt. I had spent 30 days fighting an infection in my blood. Now I was going to eradicate the infection in my family. The glass doors slid open again. I did not turn around immediately. I recognized the heavy, measured footsteps. It was Andre. Andre was my firm's lead private investigator and head of corporate intelligence. He was a former federal agent who operated with terrifying efficiency. He specialized in excavating the buried financial skeletons of corporate executives, but today his target was much closer to home. "Welcome back, Chloe," Andre said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the large room. "The hospital gown was a bad look for you. I prefer the suit." I turned around. Andre was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, carrying a massive, thick manila folder. He did not ask how I was feeling. He knew better. He walked straight to the mahogany table and dropped the heavy dossier right in the center. The impact echoed like a gunshot. "You asked for a priority 1 financial excavation on Connor Thornton and his family," Andre said, unbuttoning his jacket and taking a seat. "You gave me 24 hours. I only needed 4. The guy is practically leaving a neon trail of financial ruin wherever he goes." I sat down in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table and pulled the dossier toward me. I flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a summary of the Thornton family's corporate holdings. "Tell me," I said, staring at the glossy documents. "Jasmine claims they are elite old money from Savannah. She says they own shipping companies and commercial real estate." Andre let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "They own nothing. The Thornton family fortune dried up 2 generations ago. Connor's grandfather made a terrible bet on commercial real estate right before the market crashed in the late 90s. They have been living on credit and the fumes of their family name ever since. That massive historic estate they live in down in Savannah is carrying 3 separate mortgages, and the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday." I turned the page. My eyes scanned the long list of red withdrawal entries, outstanding liens, and defaulted loans. The sheer volume of the debt was staggering. "Connor does not have a trust fund," Andre continued, leaning forward and tapping a specific bank statement in the file. He is unemployed. His only source of income is running high-stakes sports betting rings, which he is currently terrible at. He owes over $250,000 to 3 different bookies across state lines. The country club memberships your mother is so obsessed with are completely suspended for non-payment. He is pawning everything he can get his hands on just to keep his kneecaps intact. I traced the line of a maxed-out credit card statement. Jamal at the pawn shop had been telling the absolute truth. Connor was drowning. He was a parasite looking for a host, and he had found the perfect marks in Calvin and Brenda Jefferson. If Connor has absolutely zero capital and zero credit, I said, my eyes narrowing as I looked up at Andre. How is he paying for his half of this massive high society wedding? How is he affording imported velvet tuxedos and charter flights for his completely broke parents? Andre leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. A slow, dark smirk spread across his face. That is the best part of this whole pathetic tragedy, Andre said, shaking his head. He is not paying for any of it. Your old money future brother-in-law. His family is drowning in debt, and your parents are blindly funding his lifestyle. I pulled the heavy manila dossier across the polished mahogany table. The glossy paper felt cold and substantial beneath my fingertips. This was not just a file. It was a loaded weapon. I opened the cover and began to sift through the financial wreckage of the Thornton family legacy. The first document Andre had compiled was a federal bankruptcy filing, Thornton Shipping and Logistics. Chapter 7. The filing was dated exactly 36 months ago. I scanned the asset liquidation columns with the trained eye of a private equity predator. They had not just downsized, they had been completely decimated. The courts had seized their commercial fleet. Their lucrative port contracts had been auctioned off to international competitors to cover massive defaulting loans. The multi-million-dollar shipping empire that Jasmine could not stop bragging about to her country club friends was nothing but a ghost ship resting at the bottom of a financial ocean. I turned to the next tab in the file. Andre had included a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs of the legendary Thornton family estate in Savannah. Brenda had spent the last 6 months describing the property to anyone who would listen, calling it a sprawling antebellum masterpiece, dripping in Southern charm and generational wealth. The photographs told a brutally different story. The grand wrought iron entrance gates were padlocked shut with heavy rust-covered chains. The immaculate front lawn Brenda had imagined was a wild jungle of overgrown weeds and dead oak branches. But the most damning detail was captured in a zoomed-in shot of the historic mahogany front door. Taped directly above the brass handle was a bright yellow notice of active foreclosure from a ruthless commercial bank. The bank was legally reclaiming the property in exactly 14 days. Connor Thornton was not just broke. He was a walking financial liability who was exactly 2 weeks away from being legally homeless. I sat back in my high-backed leather chair, letting the absolute absurdity of the situation wash over me. It was a masterpiece of mutual delusion. Connor was a degenerate gambler with a fabricated pedigree and a mountain of sports betting debts. He needed a lifeline. He found Jasmine, who paraded around the luxury boutiques of Buckhead in designer clothes, funded entirely by the silent allowance I used to give my parents. Connor looked at my family and saw a bottomless ATM. He thought he was marrying into a retail and real estate dynasty that could clear his bookie debts, save his family home, and keep him living in the luxury he felt entitled to. But the joke was entirely on him. Brenda and Calvin were just as financially hollow. My parents leased their luxury cars on predatory terms. They bought fake designer handbags and passed them off as authentic to their neighbors. They maintained their desperate social climbing facade through a dangerous combination of high-interest credit card debt and the ironclad financial safety net I had foolishly provided for them. Brenda looked at Connor and saw a Savannah aristocrat who could finally cement her status among the city elite. It was a spectacular collision of two empty vaults. They were two parasites desperately latching onto each other, completely unaware that the other host was utterly devoid of blood. It was a mutual gold-digging scam where both parties were furiously sprinting toward the altar, fully expecting the other side to pick up the check. I looked across the table at Andre. He was watching me process the data, his face a mask of professional satisfaction. He had seen this exact scenario play out in corporate mergers a dozen times before. Two failing companies merging in a desperate attempt to look strong to the market, only to accelerate their mutual destruction. "You understand what this means," I said, tapping my manicured nail against the glossy photographs of the foreclosed mansion. "They are playing a high-stakes game of financial chicken. Connor is pushing for this wedding to happen as fast as possible so he can secure a marriage certificate before the bank auctions off his family home. He thinks Brenda and Calvin are going to write a massive dowry check to set up their golden couple." Andre nodded, leaning his forearms on the mahogany table. "And your mother is rushing the wedding because she thinks once the ink is dry, Connor's non-existent trust fund is going to clear all of her country club debts and pay off the exorbitant catering bills. It is a brilliant scam, Chloe. You could not write a better comedy." Neither side has done a single background check because both sides are utterly terrified that a background check will expose their own lies. I stood up from my chair and began pacing the length of the glass-walled boardroom. The high heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing in the massive, quiet space. My mind began running through the financial models, processing the variables. Something was not adding up. The data was fundamentally flawed. I stopped pacing and turned back to the table. "I cut my parents off 30 days ago," I said, my voice dropping to a low hum. "When I went into the hospital with sepsis, and they explicitly refused to visit me because it conflicted with a cake tasting, I instructed my wealth management team to immediately sever their monthly allowance. I canceled the black corporate cards in Brenda's name. I froze their emergency credit lines. I even stopped paying the property tax on the suburban house. They have absolutely zero access to my liquidity." I walked back to the dossier and stared at the numbers. I thought about the scene I had just witnessed in their kitchen. Jasmine's wedding is not a small backyard affair. Brenda is importing custom velvet tuxedos from Milan. She is hiring private catering teams and award-winning pastry chefs. She booked a 300-person gala at the most expensive botanical gardens in the state. That is a $200,000 production at absolute minimum. I looked up at Andre, my eyes narrowing. If Connor is completely bankrupt and I severed all of my parents' cash flow 30 days ago, how on earth are Brenda and Calvin paying the wedding vendors? "I know their accounts, Andre. They do not have the cash reserves to cover a deposit on a rental tent, let alone a six-figure high society event. Where is the money coming from?" Andre did not say a word. He simply reached out and flipped to the very last page of the dossier. Andre flipped the heavy manila page to the very back of the dossier. He did not say a word. He simply tapped his index finger against a thick stack of stapled legal documents. The topmost sheet featured the stark, aggressive letterhead of Apex Equity Lending. It was not a traditional bank. It was a subprime shadow lender that specialized in high-risk, high-interest predatory loans. I pulled the documents closer. My eyes scanned the property address listed on the loan origination form. It was the sprawling brick estate in the suburbs, my parents' house. I frowned, shaking my head. The data was conflicting. "This is impossible," I said, looking up at Andre. "Calvin cannot leverage the equity on this house. 5 years ago, he missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank was threatening immediate foreclosure. I stepped in and cleared the arrears, but I did not just hand him a blank check. I am a private equity partner. I collateralized the bailout. I placed a legally binding ironclad lien on the property deed. Calvin cannot refinance or take out a second mortgage without my explicit notarized signature releasing that lien." Andre reached across the mahogany table and slid the second page of the packet out from under the staple. He turned it around so it faced me directly. "Look at the signature line," Chloe, Andre said quietly. I looked down at the document. It was a standard state-issued release of lien form. The document legally surrendered my financial claim to the property. At the bottom of the page in blue ink was my signature. It was a flawless imitation. The loops and angles were a near-perfect match to the way I signed my corporate acquisitions. Next to my forged signature was a bright red notary stamp. I read the name on the notary seal, William Barrett. He was a local real estate broker who played in Calvin's Tuesday morning golf foursome. Calvin forged my signature. I stated the reality of the crime settling over the boardroom like a heavy winter frost. My own father falsified a legal document and had his golf buddy illegally notarize it to strip me of my financial protection. Andre nodded, confirming my assessment. Once he erased your lien, he had a clear title. He immediately took that clear title to a shadow lender and executed a predatory second mortgage. He liquidated $250,000 of equity at an absolutely suffocating 19% interest rate. The cash was wired directly into Brenda's personal checking account exactly 12 days ago. I stared at the numbers printed on the loan agreement. $250,000, the exact estimated cost of Jasmine's overblown high society wedding. Calvin and Brenda had not just maxed out their credit cards. They had literally bet the roof over their heads on Connor Thornton. They forged my signature, committed federal wire fraud, and mortgaged their entire future to buy imported Italian tuxedos and crystal champagne towers. They assumed Connor was a multimillionaire. I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. They fully expected him to write a massive check after the honeymoon to clear all this debt. They were buying a billionaire son-in-law on credit. Exactly, Andre replied, leaning back in his chair. And Connor is pawning your grandmother's emeralds because he fully expects your parents to pay off his bookies after the wedding. They are all standing on a trap door, and everyone thinks someone else is holding the rope. It is a circular firing squad of financial ruin. The sheer staggering weight of their betrayal should have hurt. A normal daughter would have felt a crushing sense of heartbreak, realizing her father was willing to commit a felony against her just to fund her sister's vanity. But the sterile hospital room had already burned away my capacity for familial grief. I felt nothing but a sharp, brilliant focus. Calvin had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer a misguided father making poor financial choices. He was a hostile entity who had committed fraud to steal my assets. I picked up the forged release of lien document and placed it neatly into a separate folder. What is your next move? Andre asked, watching me organize the paperwork. You have enough evidence right here to send your father to federal prison. One call to the district attorney and the wedding is canceled by a SWAT team. I shook my head. That is entirely too fast, Andre. If I call the authorities now, they just look like victims of a bad decision. I do not want them to go to prison. I want them to experience the exact reality they created. I want them to stand in the middle of their fabricated high society world and watch it burn to the ground. I looked away from this dossier and let my eyes drift to the far corner of my massive mahogany desk. Sitting perfectly centered on a silver tray was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It had arrived 3 weeks ago while I was still in the hospital. I reached across the desk and picked it up. It was Jasmine and Connor's formal wedding invitation. The heavy cardstock was embossed with ridiculous gold filigree. I ran my thumb over the raised lettering detailing the location of the upcoming ceremony. The venue was listed as Rosewood Manor. It was an elite historic botanical estate located just outside the city limits. It was famous for hosting million-dollar celebrity weddings and exclusive corporate galas. The rental fee alone was staggering. I dropped the heavy cream envelope back onto the silver tray. I turned my leather chair toward my dual monitors and woke up my computer. I bypassed my standard email client and logged directly into Apex Capital Partners' proprietary commercial real estate database. Andre watched me typing rapidly, his investigator instincts immediately kicking in. What are you looking for, Chloe? I kept my eyes locked on the glowing screens as the search results populated. I am looking into Rosewood Manor, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. If my parents are spending my stolen equity to rent the most expensive venue in the state, I want to know exactly who owns the property. My fingers hammered across the backlit keyboard. The proprietary database at Apex Capital did not just list property values. It stripped companies down to their financial marrow, exposing every hidden liability and unpaid tax bill. I pulled up the commercial profile for Rosewood Manor. The screen flooded with data. From the outside, Rosewood was the crown jewel of Atlanta high society. It boasted sprawling manicured gardens, crystal conservatories, and a waiting list that spanned 2 years. But the internal ledger told a beautifully tragic story. Rosewood Manor was bleeding cash. The historic preservation costs had completely cannibalized their profit margins. They were highly overleveraged. They had taken out massive commercial loans to build a new glass pavilion, and construction delays had drained their operational reserves. They had missed their last 2 quarterly payments to their primary creditor, a mid-sized regional bank. They were swimming in toxic debt and were mere weeks away from being forced into receivership. I did not just smile. I felt a predator's absolute stillness. I turned my leather chair back to the center of the boardroom. Andre was still standing there watching my eyes track the data. "Get the acquisitions team in here right now," I commanded, my voice echoing in the glass-walled space. "I want our senior commercial real estate analysts on this immediately." Andre did not ask questions. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message. Less than 90 seconds later, 3 senior analysts rushed into the boardroom carrying tablets and legal pads. They took their seats at the mahogany table, looking at me with total focus. I projected the financial profile of Rosewood Manor onto the massive digital display screen at the end of the room. "This is Rosewood Manor," I said, standing up and pointing to the glaring red figures on the screen. "They are currently suffocating under a massive commercial loan held by Georgia Mutual. They are in technical default. I want that debt. I want Apex Capital to buy their paper today." The lead analyst adjusted his glasses rapidly, scrolling through his tablet. "We can approach Georgia Mutual," he said. "If the loan is non-performing, they will likely be desperate to get it off their books. We can offer them 70 cents on the dollar for an immediate cash buyout." "Do it," I ordered. "Wire the funds by close of business. Once we own the debt, I want you to initiate an immediate debt for equity swap with the owners of Rosewood Manor. They have zero liquidity. They cannot pay us. We will offer to absorb their entire debt portfolio in exchange for full legal ownership of the estate. If they refuse, threaten them with immediate hostile foreclosure and public bankruptcy. They have spent a century building a pristine high society reputation. They will surrender the deed to avoid the public humiliation of a seizure." The room moved into hyperspeed. For the next 48 hours, my firm operated like a precision military unit. I did not leave the Apex Capital Tower. I ordered black coffee and slept on the leather sofa in my corner office while my legal team systematically dismantled the current ownership of Rosewood Manor. We bypassed the standard bureaucratic delays by offering brutal, uncompromising cash incentives. The regional bank practically threw the defaulted loan at us, desperate to clear their quarterly risk sheets. Once Apex held the paper, we cornered the owners of Rosewood. They were an old Southern family entirely unprepared for the lethal speed of private equity. When my lead attorney presented them with the ultimatum, they folded in less than 3 hours. They signed over the deed, the holding company, and total operational control of the venue. By Thursday afternoon, the ink was dry. The transaction was fully legally binding. I sat at my mahogany desk looking at the heavy manila envelope my attorney had just hand-delivered. I slid the thick parchment out from inside. It was the master deed to Rosewood Manor. The document listed me, Chloe Jefferson, as the absolute sole legal owner of the estate. I owned the crystal conservatories. I owned the manicured gardens. I owned the very ground Jasmine planned to walk on. I placed the deed squarely in the center of my desk. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the forged second mortgage document Calvin had used to leverage my stolen equity. I set it down right next to the deed. Finally, I pulled out the comprehensive dossier Andre had compiled, detailing Connor Thornton's fake trust fund and staggering sports betting debts. 3 perfect weapons, 3 distinct fatal blows. I had the complete financial destruction of my toxic family laid out on my desk in perfect chronological order. They had called me a failure. They had mocked my quiet life and my refusal to engage in their shallow social climbing. They had literally stolen my grandmother's legacy and bet my hard-earned equity on a bankrupt, degenerate gambler just to secure a superficial country club wedding. They were about to learn exactly what happens when you attempt to sacrifice a predator to feed a parasite. I checked the sleek silver clock on my desk. It was 5 in the afternoon. Brenda and Calvin were hosting the official rehearsal dinner at Rosewood Manor this evening. The event was scheduled to begin at 7. They had rented the grand ballroom, inviting the entire fake Thornton family and every wealthy socialite in Atlanta they wanted to impress. They were preparing to drink my champagne on my property funded by my stolen money. It was time to get dressed. I left the Apex Tower and drove straight to my private tailor in Buckhead. I did not want a conservative business suit for this execution. I wanted armor. I wanted to look exactly like the multimillionaire they had completely failed to recognize. I walked into the boutique and selected a custom tailored silk gown. The dress was a deep, rich emerald green, carefully chosen to perfectly match the color of my grandmother's reclaimed stones. It featured sharp, structured shoulders, a plunging neckline, and a sleek silhouette that radiated absolute, unfiltered power. I paired the gown with black stiletto heels that sounded like striking hammers against the marble floor. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the fitting room. The woman looking back at me was lethal. The exhausted, heartbroken daughter who had stared at those black trash bags outside her bedroom door was dead. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the worn velvet jewelry box. I popped the lid open and lifted the vintage emerald and diamond necklace from its satin resting place. The heavy platinum felt cold and grounding against my collarbone as I fastened the clasp. The emeralds caught the light flashing with brilliant, defiant green fire. I gathered my weapons. I placed the deed to Rosewood Manor, the forged mortgage documents, and Connor's financial dossier into a sleek black leather portfolio. I tucked the portfolio under my arm and walked out to my car. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the highway as I drove toward the estate. I pictured Brenda fluttering around the grand ballroom, directing florists and demanding more crystal flutes. I pictured Calvin sipping scotch, pretending he belonged among the elite. I pictured Connor sweating through his rented suit, praying his bookies did not track him down before he could secure his meal ticket. They were all gathered in one room, celebrating a victory they had stolen from me. They thought they had successfully discarded the family disappointment. They had absolutely no idea that the landlord had just arrived to collect the rent. The drive up the winding oak-lined avenue of Rosewood Manor was usually reserved for the city elite. Tonight, it was my personal victory lap. I pulled my unassuming charcoal sedan past the long line of valet-parked European luxury cars. The young valet attendant rushed forward, waving a red, illuminated wand to redirect me toward the overflow parking lot, but I rolled down my window and handed him a heavy black card. It was the master access pass to the estate. His eyes went wide as he immediately recognized the credentials. He snapped to attention, pulled away the velvet ropes, and guided me into the single spot reserved exclusively for the property owner. It was positioned directly beside the main fountain, offering a flawless view of the grand entrance. The sprawling botanical gardens were illuminated by thousands of floating fairy lights, casting a warm, golden glow over the immaculate grounds. I stepped out of the car. The cool evening air brushed against the silk of my emerald gown. I reached up and adjusted the heavy platinum clasp of my grandmother's necklace, letting the cold, ancient stones rest perfectly against my collarbone. I grabbed my sleek black leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Inside rested the master deed to the estate, the forged second mortgage documents, and Connor's disastrous financial dossier. I tucked the portfolio firmly under my arm and walked up the wide marble steps toward the grand ballroom. The heavy oak double doors were propped open, flanked by massive towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported cascading orchids. I could hear the soft swell of a live string quartet drifting out into the night, perfectly mixed with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low hum of practiced high society laughter. It was an atmosphere of absolute privilege designed specifically to intimidate outsiders. I stepped across the threshold. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, featuring vaulted ceilings and massive crystal chandeliers that caught the light like shattered diamonds. Waitstaff in pristine white coats circulated fluidly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays piled high with beluga caviar and pouring glasses of vintage imported champagne. It was exactly the kind of obnoxious, overblown spectacle Brenda had dreamed of her entire life. It was a monument to fake wealth, a fragile glass house built entirely on a foundation of felony wire fraud and my stolen equity. Every single orchid, every drop of champagne, and every note played by the string quartet was funded by the illegal second mortgage Calvin had taken out on his home. I stood at the entrance for a brief moment, letting my presence fully register. I did not slink in through the back corridors like the forgotten middle child they so desperately wanted me to be. I stood tall and unyielding, the emerald silk of my custom gown pooling elegantly around my black stiletto heels. The rich, striking green fabric was a sharp, violent contrast to the sea of muted pastels and conservative navy suits dominating the room. Several guests standing near the coat check stopped talking mid-sentence. A rapid ripple of whispers began to spread outward as heads turned in my direction. They were not just looking at the gown, they were looking at the necklace. My grandmother's emeralds were legendary in certain Atlanta social circles. Seeing them draped around my neck instead of resting on Jasmine's collarbone was causing an immediate social short circuit among the country club elite. Before I could take 3 full steps into the room, the crowd parted and Brenda materialized. She moved with the frantic, aggressive speed of a cornered animal sensing an immediate threat. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver gown that looked entirely too tight, constricting her movements. Her face was flushed dark red under a thick layer of expensive makeup, and her eyes were wide with pure panic. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my bare skin. Without saying a word, she physically dragged me behind a massive floral arrangement near the entrance, desperately trying to shield me from the view of the main room. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous, panicked whisper that vibrated with rage. "I told you failures were not allowed here. We explicitly agreed you were staying away from this venue." "We did not agree to anything, Brenda," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, entirely unaffected by her physical aggression. "You told me I was a disappointment, and I simply stopped listening." She looked me up and down, her eyes snagging violently on the emerald necklace. Her jaw actually dropped as she recognized the specific cut of the stones. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch before she forcibly lowered it again, checking over her shoulder. "You have absolutely no right to wear those tonight. Jasmine is the bride. You take that off right now and hand it to me. You are going to embarrass us in front of Connor's family. They are old money Savannah aristocrats, and you are parading around here looking like a desperate attention seeker trying to ruin your sister's special night." I looked down at her hand, still clutching my forearm. I did not pull away. I just stared at her fingers with freezing clinical intensity until she nervously released her grip and took a half step back. "You are not participating in this dinner." Brenda spat out her chest, heaving heavily with anxiety. "If you absolutely insist on being in this building, you go sit in the back with the catering staff right now. You do not speak to Connor's parents. You do not speak to the guests. You stay completely out of sight until the speeches are over, and then you leave through the service exit. Do you understand me, Chloe? You will not humiliate this family tonight." I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the woman who had happily watched my father forge my signature to mortgage their home for this exact party. I looked at the woman standing in a venue that I now entirely owned, ordering me to hide in the kitchen. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt an absolute freezing corporate clarity. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the terrifying, hollow smile of a corporate liquidator who already controlled every asset in the room. I stepped smoothly past her, leaving her standing alone behind the floral arrangement with her mouth hanging open in complete shock. I did not head toward the kitchen. I did not look for the catering staff. I walked directly into the center of the grand ballroom. The string quartet was playing a soft classical piece, but the music seemed to fade into the background as my stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I walked straight toward the head table situated at the far end of the room, directly beneath the largest chandelier. Jasmine was sitting at the center wearing a white silk rehearsal dress, clutching Connor's hand. Connor looked pale and slightly nauseous, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit doors every few minutes, like a man terrified his bookies were about to arrive with baseball bats. Seated directly to his right were his parents. Mr. and Mrs. Thornton looked incredibly tense. They were drinking their champagne far too quickly, projecting an air of extreme financial panic that only a private equity predator could properly identify. They were completely bankrupt, drowning in debt, and terrified of being exposed by the wealthy family they thought they were scamming. I reached the head table. I did not wait for an invitation. I grabbed a heavy mahogany chair from a nearby empty table, dragged it directly over to the main display, and pulled it up right next to Connor's visibly sweating mother. I sat down, smoothed the emerald silk over my knees, placed my black leather portfolio on the pristine white tablecloth, and offered her a bright, terrifying smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Thornton," I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the low hum of the string quartet. Mrs. Thornton jumped slightly, her champagne splashing over the rim of her flute. Jasmine was staring at me from the center of the table, her eyes burning with pure venom. She leaned forward, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her own glass, but she could not scream at me without causing a scene in front of her future in-laws. Connor cleared his throat, attempting to project the relaxed arrogance of old money. He adjusted his silk tie and gave me a condescending nod. "We were not expecting you, Chloe. I thought your accounting job kept you tied to a cubicle." I smiled, keeping my eyes locked on his father. "I actually specialize in corporate liquidations and debt restructuring," I replied smoothly. "It is a fascinating market right now, especially in the Southeast. In fact, I was just reviewing some commercial real estate trends in Savannah. The coastal property market is taking a brutal hit this quarter. Did you know the foreclosure rates on historic antebellum estates have skyrocketed in the last 30 days? Mr. Thornton completely froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. He swallowed hard, pulling at the collar of his shirt. "Is that so?" he managed to squeak out, his eyes darting frantically toward his wife. "Yes," I continued, leaning in closer. "The banks are becoming absolutely ruthless with defaulting loans. They are seizing generational properties and auctioning them off to the highest bidder without a second thought. It is tragic, really. Seeing these allegedly wealthy families thrown out onto the street because they leveraged assets they did not actually own." Connor let out a sharp, nervous cough. His mother gripped the edge of the table, her hands shaking visibly. Brenda, realizing the conversation was spiraling out of her control, immediately shoved her way into the discussion. She leaned across the table, her heavy beaded gown catching the light. "Calvin was just telling his broker to diversify our portfolio," Brenda announced far too loudly. Her voice cut through the music, desperate to overcompensate for my presence. "We are moving heavily into international emerging markets. Calvin's tech stocks have tripled this year, and we simply must protect our liquidity." "You know how it is, Richard," she said, looking at Mr. Thornton. "When you have this much capital to manage, it becomes a full-time job just keeping track of the dividends." Richard Thornton nodded weakly, his forehead shining with a fine layer of sweat. "Yes, of course, Brenda. A full-time job." Calvin, apparently taking his cue from Brenda's desperate boasting, pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up tall, straightening his tuxedo jacket, and picked up his crystal champagne flute. He grabbed a silver dessert spoon and tapped it firmly against the glass. The sharp, ringing sound echoed through the grand ballroom, instantly silencing the 70 elite guests. The string quartet stopped playing. Every eye in the room turned toward the head table. Calvin cleared his throat, projecting his voice to ensure it reached the very back of the room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight in this magnificent venue," he began, his chest puffed out with fabricated pride. "We are gathered here to celebrate not just a wedding, but a true merging of legacies. Tonight we honor the union of two powerful, wealthy generational families." He smiled warmly at Connor and Jasmine, who were sitting rigidly holding hands. When Jasmine first brought Connor home, Brenda and I knew immediately that he was cut from the same cloth as our family. He understands the weight of expectation. He understands the responsibilities that come with managing significant family assets. The Thornton name is synonymous with Southern prestige, and we could not be more thrilled to welcome him into our dynasty. My father did not look in my direction once. He completely ignored the fact that I was sitting less than 10 feet away from him wearing a dress that cost more than his car and a necklace that belonged to the mother he rarely spoke of. He kept his focus entirely on the golden child and her fraudulent groom. Jasmine has always been the light of this family. Calvin continued, his voice thick with fake emotion. She is a woman of unparalleled grace and sophistication. She deserves a partner of Connor's distinct stature. Together, they are going to build an empire that will make both of our families incredibly proud. They are the future. He raised his crystal flute high into the air. Please raise your glasses with me, to Jasmine and Connor, to a lifetime of endless wealth, prosperity, and untarnished success. The guests murmured their agreement, raising their glasses in a glittering salute. But before anyone could take a sip, I pushed my heavy mahogany chair back from the table. The wood scraped loudly against the marble floor, shattering the polite applause. I stood up. I reached down and picked up my own crystal flute. I would like to add to that beautiful sentiment about wealth and transparency. I announced, my voice carrying perfectly across the dead-silent ballroom. I did not yell. I spoke with the calibrated, measured authority of a CEO commanding a boardroom. Calvin's smile instantly vanished. His arm dropped and he stared at me with pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, stepping forward, as if she were going to physically tackle me. "Chloe, sit down right now," she hissed through gritted teeth, her face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I completely ignored her. I set my champagne flute down and reached for my sleek black leather portfolio resting on the table. I unzipped the top and pulled out the thick stack of printed documents. The heavy paper slapped heavily against the pristine white tablecloth. I picked up the stack and began to walk slowly down the length of the head table. My emerald gown whispered against the marble floor. The 70 elite guests watched in absolute stunned silence. I stopped directly behind Connor and Jasmine. "I am so glad Calvin brought up the topic of merging financial legacies," I said, addressing the entire room while looking down at the happy couple. "Because a merger of this magnitude requires absolute disclosure, and it seems there have been a few minor omissions in the corporate filings." I separated the first set of documents and dropped them directly onto the massive floral centerpiece sitting in front of Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. "These are the federal bankruptcy filings for Thornton Shipping and Logistics from 36 months ago," I stated clearly. "And attached to the back is the active notice of foreclosure for the Thornton family estate in Savannah. The bank is legally seizing the property in exactly 14 days. Richard Thornton turned the color of ash. His wife clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. The guests at the tables nearest to us began whispering, frantically craning their necks to look at the paperwork. I took 2 more steps, stopping directly behind my parents. "And these," I said, separating the next stack of papers and dropping them in front of Brenda, "are the pawnshop receipts Connor signed yesterday when he liquidated my grandmother's emeralds to hold off his violent sports betting bookies." Connor bolted upright out of his chair, sending it crashing to the floor behind him. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She is insane. Do not listen to her." I ignored his outburst and turned my freezing gaze directly onto Calvin and Brenda. I dropped the final document onto the table. It was the forged release of lien and the predatory loan agreement. "Dad, Mom, you took out a predatory second mortgage to fund this ridiculous wedding because you thought Connor was rich," I said, my voice slicing through the chaos like a scalpel. "You committed federal wire fraud and forged my signature to leverage a house you do not even own. Connor, you are marrying Jasmine because you thought my parents were rich. You thought they could pay off your massive gambling debts and save your foreclosed mansion." I looked at the 4 of them standing there completely exposed. "You are all entirely broke. You are 2 families of absolute frauds desperately trying to scam each other out of money that simply does not exist." The grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Guests gasped in collective horror. Several people actually stood up from their tables, pointing at the documents scattered across the head table. The facade had been utterly and completely annihilated. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing scream. Her face was distorted with a level of rage I had never seen before. She grabbed a full glass of dark red wine from the table in front of her. With a primal shriek, she pulled her arm back and hurled the glass directly at me. The heavy crystal goblet sailed through the air, propelled by a lifetime of spoiled entitlement and sudden desperate panic. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect my face. I merely tilted my head a fraction of an inch to the left. The glass flew past my ear, missing me by a breathless margin, and slammed violently into the historic oak paneling right behind me. It shattered with a deafening crack. Dark red wine exploded across the polished wood, raining down onto the pristine marble floor like fresh blood. Shards of thick crystal scattered across the room, catching the light of the chandeliers. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. The sound of 70 elite guests sucking in their breath created a sudden vacuum of silence. Jasmine stood at the head table, her chest heaving, panting like a trapped wild animal. Her arm was still suspended in the air from the throw. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unhinged fury. Calvin snapped out of his temporary paralysis. His face turned a dangerous mottled purple, completely losing the refined Southern gentleman facade he had spent decades perfecting. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table, rattling the silver cutlery. He pointed a shaking, heavy finger directly at my face. He scanned the perimeter of the room until his eyes locked onto the tuxedoed venue manager, standing quietly near the kitchen doors. "Get over here right now!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with authoritarian bluster. "Have your security team throw my daughter out immediately. She is trespassing on private property and causing a violent disturbance. I am not paying for this kind of service. Remove her from this building before I call the police myself." The venue manager, an older, distinguished man named Mr. Sterling, stepped forward. He walked briskly across the marble floor, his posture perfectly straight. Calvin crossed his arms, a smug, triumphant look returning to his face. He fully expected me to be dragged out of the ballroom in front of the entire Atlanta high society. He expected me to be humiliated, banished back to the shadows where he believed I belonged. Mr. Sterling reached the head table, but he did not look at me with disdain. He did not signal for the security guards flanking the entrance. He bypassed Calvin entirely, stepping neatly over the spilled wine, and came to a stop directly behind my right shoulder. He clasped his hands behind his back and bowed his head slightly toward me in a gesture of absolute deference. "Is everything all right, Miss Jefferson?" Mr. Sterling asked, his voice echoing clearly in the dead quiet of the room. "Do you require any assistance?" Calvin's smug expression instantly evaporated. His arms dropped to his sides. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave in sheer confusion. "I rented this ballroom. I am the client. I gave you a direct order to throw her out." I slowly stood up from the heavy mahogany chair. I looked down at my father, casually smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the skirt of my emerald silk gown. I met his furious gaze with the cold, dead stare of a corporate executioner. "You cannot throw out the owner." "Dad?" I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm that sliced through the heavy air. Calvin froze. Brenda let out a strangled wheeze, clutching the edge of the table to keep herself upright. "My firm bought Rosewood Manor last Tuesday," I continued, projecting my voice so every single guest in the room could hear the absolute truth. "We purchased the commercial debt your venue owners defaulted on and executed a hostile takeover. We hold the master deed. You are currently standing in my building." I paused, letting the absolute reality of the statement crush the remaining oxygen out of their lungs. I looked at the shattered crystal and the red wine dripping down my historic oak paneling. "And as of right now, your event is officially canceled due to hostility and property damage," I announced. "I will not have my assets vandalized by desperate people. Everyone has exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property before I have the police arrest you for trespassing." The silence shattered completely. Utter pandemonium broke out across the grand ballroom. 70 high society guests erupted into a chaotic symphony of shouting, gasping, and frantic movement. Chairs scraped violently against the marble floor as people scrambled to stand up, abandoning their caviar and champagne. But the true explosion happened exactly where I knew it would, right at the center of the head table. Connor turned to Jasmine, his face twisted in a mask of horror and absolute rage. The carefully crafted illusion of his aristocratic breeding disintegrated. "You are broke!" Connor screamed, his voice cracking as he grabbed a fistful of the forged mortgage documents I had dropped on the table. "Your family is completely bankrupt. You let me pawn my grandmother's vintage jewelry to pay off my bookies because you promised me your father was buying us a penthouse in Buckhead. You are a fraud." Jasmine shoved him backward, her own desperation clawing to the surface. She grabbed the bankruptcy filings and shoved them into his chest. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, her face streaked with mascara and tears. "You told me you had a trust fund. You said your family owned international shipping lines. You are a degenerate gambler. You do not even have a house. Your family is being evicted next week." Their mutual scam was dead. The golden couple was publicly tearing each other apart over a pile of legal documents and unpaid debts. They were two broke parasites screaming at each other, realizing they had just ruined their own lives by trying to steal from an empty vault. Connor's mother began to hyperventilate loudly, clutching her chest as she sank back into her chair. His father buried his face in his hands, entirely unable to look at the crowd of wealthy socialites who were currently witnessing his total financial humiliation. Brenda was frozen. She was staring at me with a look of absolute visceral horror. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had let her husband commit federal wire fraud. She had signed a predatory second mortgage at a 19% interest rate. She had literally bet the roof over her head on a billionaire who did not exist. She owed $250,000 to a shadow lender, and she had absolutely no way to pay it back. I turned my back on the screaming couple and looked at Mr. Sterling. "Bring in the security detail," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly level amidst the screaming. "Clear the room. Ensure they do not take any of the floral arrangements or centerpieces. Those belong to the venue now." Mr. Sterling nodded sharply, raising a discreet radio to his mouth. Seconds later, the heavy oak doors swung open and 6 uniformed security guards marched into the ballroom. They fanned out, forming a solid wall of dark uniforms as they began aggressively ushering the panicked guests toward the main exits. The sun rose over Atlanta without an ounce of pity. The harsh morning light filtered through the thin, stained curtains of a cheap roadside motel out on Interstate 20. It was a brutal, agonizing contrast to the crystal chandeliers and imported, cascading orchids of Rosewood Manor. Jasmine sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. She was still wearing her custom-beaded bridal gown. The heavy silk was deeply wrinkled, the intricate pearl beading torn in several places, and the hem stained with dark mud from her frantic, ungraceful exit the night before. The dress was entirely unpaid for, and in the cold morning light it looked exactly like what it was, a fraudulent costume. Connor was not offering comfort. He was frantically shoving his designer suits, expensive watches, and leather loafers into a scuffed duffel bag. He moved with the desperate, erratic energy of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. He did not look at her. He did not offer apologies or promises of a better future. He was entirely focused on his own survival. "Where are you going?" Jasmine asked, her voice raw and hoarse from hours of hysterical screaming. "I am leaving," Connor snapped, yanking the zipper of his bag closed with a sharp metallic sound. "My bookies saw the viral videos from last night, Jasmine. The whole city knows your family is completely bankrupt. They know the wedding is permanently canceled, and they know I do not have your father's fake money to pay my massive debts. If I stay in Atlanta for another 24 hours, they will break both of my legs." "You promised me a penthouse," Jasmine sobbed, clutching the ruined silk of her dress. "You told me we were a power couple. You said we were going to rule this city." "We were a mutually beneficial scam," Connor replied, his voice dripping with sudden, undisguised disgust. "I needed an immediate financial bailout, and you needed a shiny status symbol to parade in front of your country club friends. But your father is a broke fraud who took out a criminal second mortgage to buy shrimp toasts, and you are nothing but a spoiled, useless liability. We are completely done." He grabbed his heavy duffel bag and walked out the flimsy motel door, letting it slam shut behind him. The cheap wood rattled in the frame. He did not look back. Jasmine was left sitting alone in a cheap motel room, shivering in an unpaid bridal gown, with absolutely nothing to her name but a shattered reputation and a cancelled future. Miles away in the upscale, manicured suburbs, Calvin and Brenda were experiencing their own unique brand of total, absolute destruction. The financial guillotine I had carefully positioned the night before dropped at exactly 8 in the morning. Calvin was sitting at his expansive marble kitchen island, desperately trying to log into his offshore brokerage accounts. He was trying to scrounge together enough liquid cash to hire a high-powered criminal defense attorney. His laptop screen repeatedly flashed a glaring red error message. "Access denied, account frozen." He slammed his fist against the granite countertop and grabbed his phone, dialing his private banker's direct line. The call bypassed the ringing entirely and went straight to an automated legal disclaimer informing him that his accounts were under active federal review. Because I had flagged the forged second mortgage documents directly with the original lenders, the fraud department at Georgia Mutual had moved with lethal, unprecedented speed. When a borrower commits federal wire fraud to secure $250,000, banks do not send polite warning letters. They initiate immediate total asset seizures to protect their capital. Brenda paced the length of the gourmet kitchen, her hands trembling violently. She was still wearing yesterday's smeared makeup. Her hair was a tangled rat's nest of expensive hairspray and sheer panic. "What is happening?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and borderline hysterical. "Call the bank, Calvin. Tell them there was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them it was a simple clerical error." "It is not an error," Calvin roared, picking up his phone and throwing it across the room, where it shattered into pieces against the stainless steel refrigerator. Chloe gave them the physical proof, Brenda. She handed them the exact legal documents I illegally altered. They have frozen the checking accounts. They have frozen the retirement portfolios. They have locked the home equity lines. We have absolutely zero access to capital. We cannot even buy groceries. The devastating reality hit Brenda like a physical blow. Her knees instantly buckled and she collapsed into a heavy dining chair, holding her head in her hands. The pristine suburban mansion, the luxury imported cars, the exclusive country club memberships, they were all entirely gone. They had leveraged every single tangible asset they possessed to fund a pathetic illusion of wealth for a daughter who was currently stranded in a motel, and they had lost everything. "The police are going to arrest you," Brenda whispered, her eyes wide with unfiltered terror. "They are going to take the house. We are going to be homeless." Calvin stared blankly at the polished marble floor, his chest heaving. The arrogant, demanding patriarch who had demanded absolute perfection and ruthlessly discarded his middle child for failing to meet his superficial standards was completely broken. His pristine reputation was dead. He had nothing left but the devastating, crushing consequences of his own arrogance. Desperation breeds an incredibly dangerous kind of audacity. They had no money, they had no legal defense, they had no social standing left to protect. They only had one remaining option, and it was the one person they despised more than anyone else on earth. "Get in the car," Calvin ordered, his voice a hollow, desperate rasp, pushing himself up from the kitchen island. "We are going to see your daughter." They did not bother to shower or change their clothes. They drove in absolute suffocating silence, navigating the heavy morning traffic toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. They pulled up to the sleek, geometric entrance of the Apex, a hyper-exclusive residential high-rise where the luxury penthouse suites sold for 8 figures. They walked through the heavy sliding glass doors into the minimalist marble lobby. The concierge, a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit, immediately stood up from his mahogany desk, raising a hand to stop them. "Excuse me, sir. You cannot just walk in here," the concierge said firmly, eyeing Calvin's disheveled, wrinkled tuxedo and Brenda's ruined evening gown. Calvin ignored him completely. He grabbed Brenda's arm and shoved roughly past the desk, barreling directly toward the private, gold-plated elevator reserved exclusively for the penthouse residents. The concierge shouted for security, but the heavy elevator doors were already sliding shut. Calvin hit the illuminated button for the top floor. The elevator shot upward, ascending 40 stories into the Atlanta skyline. They were terrified, angry, and completely out of options. They were riding up to demand salvation from the exact same woman they had gleefully thrown to the wolves. The soft melodic chime of the private elevator echoed through the expansive living space, indicating an unauthorized direct ascent from the lobby. The brushed steel doors slid open instantly, disrupting the quiet morning atmosphere of my penthouse. The visual contrast was jarring. My home was a fortress of modern minimalist luxury, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the downtown Atlanta skyline. The morning sun poured across the wide plank oak floors and illuminated the massive imported marble kitchen island. I was sitting on a brushed velvet bar stool, casually sipping a freshly pulled espresso. Tasha, my lead acquisitions director, and the only person who had actually sat by my side during my darkest days, was sitting across from me reviewing commercial real estate portfolios on her tablet. Calvin and Brenda stumbled out of the elevator cabin and stepped onto the hardwood floor. They looked completely destroyed. The arrogant posture they had maintained for decades had entirely evaporated. Calvin was still wearing the exact same tuxedo from the night before, heavily wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale sweat and panic. His bow tie was undone, hanging limply around his neck. Brenda looked even worse. Her heavily beaded silver evening gown was missing stones. Her hair was a tangled, chaotic mess, and her eyes were bloodshot from hours of hysterical crying. They froze the moment they took in the sheer, staggering magnitude of the penthouse. Their eyes darted wildly across the custom artwork, the vaulted ceilings, and the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding them. The brutal reality of their situation was finally cementing itself in their minds. The daughter they had routinely dismissed as a pathetic failure was living like a billionaire while they were currently facing total financial ruin and federal wire fraud charges. "Chloe," my mother choked out her voice, a desperate grating whisper as she took a hesitant step forward. I did not stand up. I did not offer them a seat. I slowly lowered my porcelain espresso cup, placing it gently onto its matching saucer. The ceramic clinked softly against the marble island. "You are trespassing, Calvin," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional warmth. "But since you have already bullied your way past my concierge, you might as well state your business before I have you forcibly removed." Calvin swallowed hard, aggressively, rubbing his trembling hands over his face. The pompous, commanding patriarch who had demanded absolute obedience was completely gone. He stepped forward, his shoulders slumped, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "They locked the accounts, Chloe," he pleaded, gripping the edge of the marble island as if it were a life raft. "The bank froze everything at 8 o'clock this morning. They are initiating foreclosure proceedings on the house. They are seizing my retirement portfolios." Connor packed his bags and abandoned Jasmine at a filthy motel on the interstate. "We have absolutely nothing left. You have to call your legal team. You have to tell them to drop the fraud inquiry." Brenda shoved her way forward, tears streaming down her ruined face. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled my arm back out of her reach. "Please, Chloe," Brenda sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly against the high ceilings. "We made a terrible mistake. We were just trying to secure a good future for your sister. We were trying to protect the family legacy. We are your parents. You cannot let your own flesh and blood be thrown out onto the street like garbage. You have this massive firm. You own this entire penthouse. You clearly have millions of dollars at your disposal. Paying off $250,000 second mortgage would be absolute pocket change for you. You have to save the house. We need a bailout." I looked at the two of them standing there, shamelessly begging for salvation, using the very same family loyalty they had weaponized against me my entire life. They did not apologize for forging my signature. They did not apologize for stealing my hard-earned equity. They did not apologize for attempting to hand my grandmother's legacy over to a degenerate gambling addict. They were only crying because they had been caught, and they wanted me to write a check to shield them from the consequences of their own spectacular greed. Tasha sat silently across from me, her eyes locked onto her tablet, but her posture radiated absolute disgust. She knew exactly what these people had put me through. She knew how hard I had fought to build my empire from the absolute bottom. I picked up my espresso and took one final slow sip. I did not yell. I did not scream. The absolute freezing void of emotion in my voice was far more lethal than any display of anger. "You forged my signature to a predatory loan," I said, staring directly into Calvin's bloodshot eyes. "You committed a federal felony to buy shrimp toasts and crystal centerpieces for a wedding that did not even happen. You bet your entire suburban existence on a broke parasite because you were too blinded by your own obsessive social climbing to actually run a basic background check. You do not have a legacy, Calvin. You have a mountain of toxic debt." "But we are a family," Brenda wailed, clutching her chest dramatically. "Families support each other in times of crisis. You cannot just turn your back on us when we are drowning." I slowly nodded my head. "You are absolutely right, Brenda," I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Families do support each other in times of severe medical and financial crisis. So I'm going to give you exactly the same level of support you offered me when I needed it most." I reached into my designer leather tote resting on the counter. I pulled out my slim black wallet. I did not retrieve a platinum credit card. I did not pull out a corporate checkbook. I reached into the cash compartment and extracted a single crisp $1 bill. I smoothed the green paper out against the cold surface of the marble. With 2 fingers, I slowly slid the dollar bill across the wide expanse of the kitchen island until it came to a complete stop directly in front of Brenda's trembling hands. "I gave you exactly what you invested in me when I was dying in the hospital," I said, holding her horrified gaze. "Good luck." Brenda stared down at the single dollar bill as if it were a live grenade. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Calvin's face contorted with helpless, furious rage, but he had absolutely no power left to wield. He was a broken man standing in a castle built by the daughter he had thrown away. I did not break eye contact as I gave a sharp, subtle nod toward the far wall. 2 massive private security contractors dressed in tailored black suits stepped silently out of the shadows. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency, instantly closing the distance between the wall and the kitchen island. "Escort them to the street," I ordered. Calvin tried to open his mouth to protest, but the guards were already moving. They flanked my parents, grabbing them firmly by the arms and physically guiding them backward toward the open elevator. Brenda began sobbing loudly, her fingers reflexively clutching the single dollar bill as she was marched backward. The security guards deposited them roughly into the elevator cabin and stepped back. The brushed steel doors slid shut, cutting off Brenda's wailing cries and sealing them out of my life forever. The luxury penthouse returned to a state of perfect, immaculate silence. Tasha picked up her coffee cup and offered me a small, deeply respectful nod of approval. I turned my velvet chair around, facing the massive wall of glass. The morning sun was rising higher, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the Atlanta skyline. I sat there in total peace, looking out over the city. It was a beautiful, sprawling city where I owned the buildings, controlled the commercial debt, and held all the power. The story was completely over. It did not end with a tearful reunion or a long, preachy monologue about family forgiveness. It ended with the sweet, quiet, absolute satisfaction of a woman looking out over the empire she had built entirely from scratch. The most powerful lesson from Chloe's journey is that true security and self-worth can only be built through authentic independence, hard work, and integrity. Toxic family dynamics and superficial manipulation might create a temporary illusion of success, but an empire founded on lies and deceit collapses instantly under the weight of truth. Never mistake someone's quiet resilience for weakness. While superficial people waste their time chasing status and exploiting others, silent builders are busy laying the foundation for their own unstoppable empires. Ultimately, living well and succeeding on your own terms remains the absolute highest form of poetic justice. If Chloe's fierce journey of self-reliance inspired you to value your own worth, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and unforgettable reckonings.